Thank you, Orla, and Dara, Trevor, for having me along here today. My name is Dónal Rice. I'm the Senior Standards and Monitoring Officer with the National Disability Authority. And I'm going to spend about 10 minutes introducing these new regulations, the Web Accessibility Directive, as they've been transposed into Irish regulations. Then I'm going to hand you over to Alistair, who's going to do the Mentimeter, a little quiz, but also, or a little poll, but also to give experiences from the UK and how this is being implemented and what are some good practices in the UK and experiences from the UK in implementing these regulations in the higher education sector. And at the end, if we've time, I'll come back and speak a little bit more about what our role as the national monitoring body is. So the Centre for Excellence Universal Design is a statutory body. It's part of the National Disability Authority. And we're a small team who work in the area of standards development, raising awareness around universal design, and we work in the area of education and continuous professional development. So I've been with the Centre for I think since 2008, and I changed role at the end of February into the role of Senior Standards and Monitoring Officer to lead out on setting up the monitoring function under these regulations. So I also lecture. I was the first public sector equality and human rights duty manager with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and I also lecture. I'm an associate lecturer with the Institute of Public Administration on Equality and Human Rights, and I am undertaking an LLM in disability law and policy looking at accessibility with NUI Galway. So I do come to this, I suppose, not necessarily from a technical perspective, although I was a web developer at one point in time, but really, I suppose, from a more equality and policy perspective. So let's discuss the directive and the new regulations. The directive was finalized in 2016, so it's a European directive of the Parliament and the Council, and it's looking at the accessibility of websites and mobile applications, mobile apps of public sector bodies. So the package of measures is a directive, and then there's what are called two implementing decisions. So they're like annexes to the directive, and they're very much more prescriptive about what public bodies must do and the monitoring that must happen. One implementing decision refers to an accessibility statement, and both myself and Alistair will touch on an accessibility statement more in our presentations. And the second implementing decision is all about what us as the monitoring body must do, how we monitor, how we choose what public sector websites to monitor, how we conduct the monitoring and reporting. So this directive, this package of measures was transposed into Irish law on the 23rd of September last under what's called SI, Statutory Instrument number 358. And you can see an overview of that on the NDA website, and there's a link to that in the chat function there, but I'm going to cover most of it here. So what is this, and is this old hat or is it new news? I mean, there have been existing obligations to make websites accessible in Ireland since the Disability Act 2005. That covers public sector bodies. That requires that services provided to the public are accessible, and the code of practice under the Disability Act for the accessibility of public services and information refers to the standard that I'm going to talk about in a moment, which is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And indeed, the Equal Status Act outlaws discrimination across a number of grounds, including accessibility and disability. And the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Act 2014, section 42 of that, places a public sector equality and human rights duty on all public bodies, and specifically mentions universities and institutes of technology as being in scope of that public sector duty. So there's an existing body of legislation that obliges public bodies to make their services accessible. But all of the above are quite non-specific to making websites and mobile apps accessible. So what the directive does to some degree is it introduces a very specific set of measures that must be implemented. Now, the directive contains what are called core aspects, and this would be fairly typical of a directive. It sets out some high-level kind of essential requirements, and then goes on to specify how those core requirements are to be met. And their core requirements are that websites and mobile apps of public bodies must be perceivable. So can I see and access the content? Then once I am able to access the content, am I using any one of my senses? Am I able to operate the interface? Once I can operate the interface, is the content there understandable to me? And will it work with my assistive technology or on the device of my choosing that I wish to access this content on? So those 4 principles are called POUR, and they're actually taken from those accessibility guidelines that I mentioned, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So conformity with this directive, to use the kind of legal term, is proven by making sure that websites and mobile apps are accessible with a European standard. Now, the reason it's a European standard that's specified in the directive is for legal European law reasons. But essentially, this standard cut and pastes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines success criteria A and AA level into the standard. So essentially, conformance with the directive is conformance with the A and AA success criteria of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So I suppose the burning question for many of you on the webinar today is, are higher education sector bodies covered? And the definition of a public body provided in the regulations is very, very broad. It doesn't specifically mention higher education, universities, institutes of technology like the IREC Act does, but it is very broad. And without going into the text of what it says there, I would advise that it really is up to a higher education organization, institution, to satisfy themselves that they're not covered by this, because the definition of a public sector body is so broad in these regulations, it would appear to cover to all different types of organizations that are regulated, funded, part funded, and have conduct work of public interest. So the most prescriptive, I suppose, answer I can give you to the question, are higher education institutions covered, is really it would appear that an organization would have to satisfy themselves that they're not covered and make a case that they're not covered because the definition and scope of a public body covered by these regulations is indeed very broad. So what's the content covered? Well, what's new here is that it's both websites and mobile apps. So if you're thinking of mobile apps in the public sector, I would think of apps for public transport providers, for example. But again, the directive is quite prescriptive, and it talks about the different types of web content that are covered. And this includes things such as Office file formats, so Word and PDF. So in my own organization, we have 2 websites, but actually the vast majority of content going on those websites isn't the web pages themselves. It's all the guidance and architectural guidance, research, policy advice that we publish in Word and PDF. It also covers videos, and it requires that if a video has been recorded and is put onto a website, that within 14 days of that video being recorded, it needs to have captions. And interestingly, it also covers extranets and intranets. So again, a very wide scope here. And extranets and intranets can be considered to incorporate websites that are behind a registration or an authentication process, namely where someone has to log on and register and access the content behind this authentication or login wall. And that would appear to cover learning management systems as well for higher education sector bodies. So the intranets and extranets covers a very wide range of, I suppose, what are not traditionally associated as being the corporate website. It's actually, if you're using an intranet or an extranet to provide services, information to people outside of your organization or outside of your corporate website, that needs to be accessible. So there are some exemptions. There are some exemptions for some of the types of content that I mentioned. So some office file formats and videos that were produced at a certain period of time before a certain date are not in scope of the regulations. Third-party content not under control of a public body is also not covered. So if you could imagine or think here of maybe a tweet that is retweeted by your organization and that appears on the homepage through a Twitter embedded device on your homepage, that Twitter or that tweet is not within scope of these regulations, not generated by your organization, it's not under the responsibility of your organization. So there are some types of content that are exempt there. But I'm going to hand you over to Alistair now, but just to emphasize that it's a very wide-ranging scope of organizations and a very wide-ranging scope of content covered under these new regulations. So thank you for now, and I'll hand you over to Alistair. I'll stop screen sharing here, Alistair, to give you the opportunity to do that.
Thank you very much, Dónal. So I'll bring up my screen. So just very quickly, let me just check that. Yeah, everybody should be able to see that now. So we've got a very short Mentimeter just to give us a sense as to where people's confidence levels are. So the link that I've popped in the text chat, and I'll pop it in again if you just missed it, if it's gone up off the screen. If you click on that link, you'll get to this resource. There's 2 pages in this resource. The first page here is the Mentimeter part where the 3 questions: how much do you know about the legislation? So drag that to the appropriate place. Obviously, I should have done this before, Dónal, really, because now you'll know lots more about the legislation than you did at the beginning. But also, how confident do you feel about digital accessibility? Drag that across. And then the last one, do you have good guides on creating accessible digital content that your colleagues, your staff would be able to use? So 3 very simple questions. Click those, slide those and click submit. And then to see all the answers, we'll go to the navigation bar at the bottom right, where you'll be able to go and see what everybody said. So I will move my screen over and just see the combined results as they come in. So we had 19 people so far. There are 55 people on the call, so I'll wait a little bit longer. And this is really helpful to us. It's particularly helpful, I think, to Dónal and to Dara and Orla and Trevor ahead in terms of working out what communication needs to be in place, how to support organizations and so on. So we've reached 25. If we can get just a few more. Okay. So there is a pretty clear pattern. There are 1 or 2 people, organizations where we're getting relatively high figures. So we got 1 there, 1 person feeling they know a lot about the legislation. That was probably Dónal who put that one in. How confident do people feel? So generally we can see it's not a high level of confidence about what digital accessibility means and what the implications are. And then in terms of good guides, now again, that's an interesting one, because we can, together, there's been a lot of work in the UK on this, and there are groups that you could join, like mailing lists and things, where you could steal other people's information that's being freely shared. And of course, there's some fantastic opportunities for you to create your own local content. Okay, so that's really helpful as a background. Now, what I want to do is in some ways, I'm hoping I'm going to be able to give you a little bit of more confidence than you are perhaps starting with. So what I'm going to start with here is I want to give you some definitions, and I want to introduce the concept of accessibility maturity and think about who needs to be involved in your organization. And then I'll end a little bit with some of our experience of accessibility statements in a UK content, in terms of trying to make them not just compliant, but make them useful too, because those are two slightly different things. So, and I want to start by not looking at anything other than a car, because in one person's perspective, the perspective of a mechanic, for example, a car is all about standards. It's about sprockets, it's about gears, it's about tolerances, it's about timing. Those are all incredibly technical things. But actually, for most of us, a car doesn't look like that at all. What a car looks like is on the right-hand side, where you can see a nice seat, a nice steering wheel. You can see where all the different features and buttons that you press and levers, where they are. And digital accessibility is very much like that, because on the one hand, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are the equivalent of what's under the bonnet. They're the bits that actually very, very few people fully understand. In any organization, there may be one or two people who could actually make sense of this, and they would be in the IT team, almost certainly. But does that mean that the web accessibility regulations are all to do with the IT team? It definitely doesn't, because the driver side is what accessibility means from a user's perspective. So as a student, or indeed as a member of staff, can I magnify the content? Can I magnify the page? Can I magnify without having to scroll left and right? Can I change colors and contrasts? Understand an image that I can't see, a video that I can't hear, operate things in different ways, use different devices? And Dónal spoke to this under the 4 principles: perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. The robustness is about that different devices. Can I navigate in all kinds of different ways, by a page landmark, by headings, subheadings, bookmarks, hyperlinks, and so on? Can I use text to speech? So I want to say something which might sound controversial. I want to say that accessibility legislation is needed to correct a deficit. But it's not the deficit we think of. It's needed to correct the deficit in disabled people. That is not where the deficit lies. The deficit lies in the people that do not know how to create content that is as accessible to a disabled person as to a non-disabled person. And so if we look at things written on a piece of paper. So here's things on a piece of paper or a paper handout. The difference between a professionally produced paper handout and something that I put together on a typewriter is very, very little in terms of its potential to give different functionality. As soon as you start talking about a document online or a presentation online, the potential accessibility of a document that somebody has been trained, somebody knows, and in fact it's only probably half a dozen things that you can be taught in 20 minutes. If you know how to create an accessible document compared to somebody that just throws the document together the way they always did, the potential accessibility difference is huge. And that is the deficit that I'm talking about. It's the skill deficit. the deficit of awareness, practice, skills or training, it's that creates the barrier. It's not a deficit in somebody's sensory perception or a difference in their neurodiversity. They haven't got the deficit. The deficit is in knowing how to create barrier-free content. And accessibility is not, therefore, for one or two people. It's not for your disability team. It's not for your IT team. It's a mindful way of working, and it's about a professionalism that is on a par with respecting copyright, handling personal data, complying with health and safety. It's the same legal standing, it's the same importance, and it's the same ubiquitous character that everybody in the organization needs to understand something about that. Now, if you got all the web content accessibility guidelines right across your VLE, your website, your content, you would not have become inclusive necessarily, because standards are only a part of being inclusive. Compliance is only the starting point. So technical compliance will not guarantee a good learning experience. And I've, in the course of my work, I do kind of learner journey audits across lots of different courses on different university and college websites. And I have seen so many that might have been technically quite accessible. In most cases, they're not terribly accessible technically, never mind anything else. But even if they are accessible technically, if they look like the right-hand side image here, where I've got like a screenshot from somebody's Moodle course, and it says week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, and you open up week 1 and it says, and there's 4 Word documents, week 1 case study, week 1 handout, week 1 intro, week 1 reading, and then week 1 slides. If it looks like that, then it's going to be a monoculture of text that is dull, disengaging, difficult to understand for some learners, a lonely and isolating experience, potentially overwhelming for a lot of learners. So we need to remember that pedagogy and the kinds of experiences that you give your students are just as important as the technical inclusivity. And I've got a very simple model here where it kind of pulls together learning design and technical accessibility. So if something is technically accessible but pedagogically really dull, you end up with something that's boring and it's potentially excluding for a different reason for a different group of people. If it's not technically inclusive, but it's pedagogically inclusive, but it's poor on the technical inclusion, then it's quite engaging, but it's going to exclude different people for different reasons. What you really want to aim for is using digital technology creatively, using it with a variety of ways, using a variety of media, but making sure that your basic practices are right in order to minimize barriers for everyone. So that takes us to the model of accessibility maturity. So compliance and maturity are not the same thing. If a disabled person has a compliant relationship with the organization, that feels and sounds different from having a mature relationship with the organization. So this is a very simple model. I developed this probably about 12, 13 years ago now, but we've recently updated it. I've worked very closely with AbilityNet, where we've taken this original simple model and we've created something that's highly objective, measurable, lots of questions that can be built around it. But basically it starts off with these 5 stages. The stage of luck, where actually we don't know what we're doing. Let's just hope and pray we don't have disabled learners, or if we do, let's hope and pray that they're nice. Or the tokenism. Now, people are often surprised that having a brilliant student support department, disability support department, people are surprised that that only counts as tokenism. But the reason for that is because if the problems that your student support team are sorting out for all those students are problems that needn't have existed in the first place, you're not really mature. And some work by the the English Office for Standards in Education, for Ofsted, work they did in 2010 showed that where the standard of teaching was better, the barriers experienced by disabled students were significantly lower, simply because the quality of the teaching actually took students over barriers and removed barriers for students. So the tokenism is where you've got fantastic support, lots of ladders in place for disabled students, but you've done nothing about the walls that they need the ladders to climb over. And then when you get to standards, when you get to the point where everything is, as close as possible compliant with the web standards, that's a good place to be, but you are not yet mature, because that might be achieved by a really immature way, like having nothing online. I can achieve really high levels of digital accessibility by having nothing online, or by only having Word documents, no video, no interactivities, no quizzes. So I'm standards compliant, but I'm pretty immature in terms of giving that bigger picture of what accessibility, maturity and inclusion might look like. And then there's a stage where you move beyond standards and you talk about ownership. So all your staff have the skills and expertise to begin to use digital resources in creative ways, and adapting different things to different learners as required, but knowing how to minimize barriers. And then the partnership stage is where you actually say, why don't we involve disabled students, disabled staff, people with assistive technologies? Why don't we involve them in creating content for us, creating courses? And when you start to map onto that simple model the different roles within your organization, you begin to find that actually everybody has a role to play. And disability support, actually, I haven't quite finished this diagram. I thought I had tweaked this diagram. I forgot to save it. Disability support are the only people involved at that immature level. Actually, they come back into the frame at that partnership level, because they're the ones that can really help people designing courses, procuring systems and so on. They can say, well, actually, that will be really good because that would suit a lot of the learners that we have. So everybody is involved. Now, in terms of the accessibility maturity, if you wanted to go and look at that yourself, there is a downloadable free kind of top level tool that maps out those different levels, luck, tokenism, standards, etc., to 8 different cultural lenses in your organization. There's also training available if you wanted to go deeper than that, where each of those 8 lenses is evidenced through 80 different questions across those 8 lenses to give you a maturity score for your organization. And I've got a link to some training that's going on with that. It's a great way of beginning to look at gap analysis for strategic and practical pathways. We can work, the model can be applied at a bespoke level. Spent yesterday afternoon with a university with a group of, I think, about 12 staff, working through the results of this individual one, 40 plus staff contributing to 4 different questionnaires, pulling all the data together to help identify strength, weakness, variations of perception and so on. And there's also, in terms of the universal design for learning skills and expertise you have in Ireland, there's also a course-based, a module-based accessibility maturity model that's got different lenses, but you could look at any one of your courses. Is this mapped to universal design for learning, different e-learning frameworks? There's lots of links there that you can look at at your leisure if you want to download the slides. Just 2 things on accessibility statements. They are a significant part of your obligation under the new legislation. Having a compliance statement really benefits you, because you cannot create a compliance statement without knowing what works and what doesn't work, and also without saying what you are doing about the bits that don't work. You have to be transparent about that. So it's great for self-awareness, great for action planning, and it gives Dónal and people in his teams an opportunity to then look at national benchmarking, because it's all based on the same compliance requirements. But the one thing I would say is that you could have a completely compliant statement that was couched in quite technical language that was actually very difficult for a student to understand. So again, with some colleagues, I've developed the facts model where compliance sits right in the middle of it, but there's a whole series of pointers and there's links there to details that you can have a look at. But it takes your compliant statement and it builds on it so that it's formative, it's actionable, it's transparent, and it's supportive. And there's a nice example there. I've worked with quite a few organisations in the UK. Have a look at some of the accessibility statements and how much richer putting in some of that additional detail. It's not required at the kind of basic compliance level, but it's really valuable. And finally, this is about policy, process, practice, and people. So make sure that all of those are touched by it. Back to Dónal.
Thanks, Alistair. And just to pick up where I left off, a couple of questions coming in there we might answer together at the end, Alistair. But I just want to go through what our role is as the national monitoring body under these new regulations. I mean, the core of our work is to establish a monitoring methodology that's transparent, replicable, understandable, and impactful. And I was involved in some of the negotiations of during the development of the directive, and I was always emphasizing, and Ireland was also always emphasizing, that whatever feedback the monitoring body gives to public bodies, it needs to be useful. It ought not to be esoteric and statistical, stating that you're 59.6% compliant with this number of success criteria. It needs to be couched in a way that public bodies can understand and be able to action. One core function that we have is that it's up to us to develop a register of websites to be monitored and mobile apps to be monitored in a given monitoring period. So the regulations have this notion of a monitoring period that can be 2 or 1 years in duration, and that is a set number of bodies are to be monitored in that period. So not everybody is going to get monitored all the time. And the regulations also set out this notion of what's called an in-depth review and a simplified review. So a simplified review takes a subset of the main accessibility success criteria from the standard and conduct those across about 200 websites and mobile apps in the public sector. The in-depth is about 25 websites and 5 mobile apps. And an in-depth review is a root and branch review of a public body's web presence and websites. It's incumbent on us to communicate those results to public bodies and to answer queries. And we're already fielding quite a number of queries from public bodies. And ultimately, it's our obligation or duty as the monitoring body to submit a report. Now, in this instance, because this directive was transposed by the Department of Communications, it's to the Minister of Communications, the Minister of Environment, Climate and Communications. But along with these core functions, it's incumbent on us as the monitoring body to at least attempt to inform strategic directive of direction of ICT policy and practice, and that includes in the education, the higher education sector, but right across the public sector. We're making efforts to build awareness around this, around the regulations, and to provide guidance. And one piece of guidance that we're about to publish is exactly on that, accessibility statements, how to write a compliant accessibility statement. But also to support capacity and build confidence in public sector. Now, we can't do it right across the public sector. Alistair mentioned my teams. Well, you're kind of looking at 50% of my team, and the other 50% is at another webinar this afternoon. So we are going to need, as much help as possible from organizations, and we're delighted that AHEAD has been so proactive in this area to promote awareness and build capacity around accessibility. These are some detailed timelines, but the end of the, just to emphasize that the transposition of the directive happened in September, and the first monitoring period is due to finish this December. The first monitoring period actually started last January, 12 months. So I've been in situ for 2 months now. So we have a bit of a challenge to try and meet that deadline. But the monitoring periods then will continue on a yearly basis after that. So every year will be a monitoring period, and reports will be furnished to the Minister on a 3-yearly basis after the first monitoring period that finishes in December. So just to emphasize again what public bodies must do: ensure their websites and mobile apps comply with the European Harmonized Standard, which is in essence Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And just to say, we're not the only region or country who has brought in these obligations. All universities in the United States, for example, have been making efforts in this area for quite a number of years. And looking more closely to home, universities in Ireland and the UK and right across Europe have been making various attempts and efforts at this over the years. So we're not starting from naught here, from zero here, but it does bring in, I suppose, a minimum level of compliance that must be achieved. The second thing that public body must do, I would suggest, is to maintain a detailed accessibility statement. So that's what is a requirement under the regulations. And again, it does prompt public bodies to do certain things, as Alistair alluded to. And what it does is, one of the things that I'm particularly taken with this, it includes a feedback mechanism and information on asking for support or making a complaint. So just to finish on the accessibility statement, this notion of a feedback mechanism is something that I see missing from most accessibility statements as they exist on public sector websites and higher education websites at the moment in Ireland. Very often they give kind of quasi-technical advice on how to zoom in and out of your browser. Well, if I have a need for a website to be accessible, I don't need you telling me how to use my technology. I need you to make sure that it reaches a minimum level of compliance set out in the regulations. So this accessibility statement is very prescriptive in its structure. And as I said, we're about to publish guidance on this. Hopefully when the developer we asked to do it finishes his work by the end of the week, and we expect to be able to publish it next week. But the notion of this feedback mechanism, I think, is quite important. And there's also a notion of an enforcement procedure. And I know this is probably a question in some of your minds. What is the sanction for not complying? Well, actually, the directive and the regulations do not bring in new sanctions. It leverages the current enforcement, or rather complaints and redress mechanisms that are in place in Irish law. So a person can make a complaint under the Equal Status Act, or they make a complaint to the organisation under the Disability Act. And we will provide links, and our current guidance on the directive, on the regulations, provide links as to what those two complaints and redress mechanisms are. But they have to be front and centre on the accessibility statement of public sector websites going forward. So I'll hand you back to Alistair, and after that we'll maybe round up by asking or answering some of the questions that you've been asking.
Hello, yes. So I'm here with Dónal now to look at the questions. I've been looking at some of the questions. There's a question that I was just typing a response to, but it's from John Harding. And I've got to be careful here, because obviously I can tell you what we've done in the UK context, but you are a sovereign, independent nation, and you may be interpreting things slightly differently. So John's question was academic, well, it was about the the resources required to make automated captions, such as lecture capture platforms, to make those properly accurate. Academic staff do not have time to edit and support. Teams do not have the resources. What level of accuracy is, open quotes, accessible? Do you have a view as an auditing body?
I mean, the regulations are quite clear. It must be accurate. The regulations are, I suppose, quite binary in some way, in that either the captions are accurate or they're not. And let's face it, most auto-generated captions lack the accuracy that we see today in this webinar that are being provided by our captioner. But let's be practical here. I think it's you know, it's reasonable to say that to expect that every higher education institution is going to be able to overnight provide captions of 100% accuracy on all videos of lectures is not feasible. But I would suggest that it is a matter of trying to progressively realize better accuracy and better provision. And one thing we were speaking of beforehand, Alistair, is, you know, what you called unintended consequences of regulations. What we don't want to see is video captions, or sorry, video capture of lectures not going onto LMSs because there's not the possibility of making the captions either fully accurate or providing them at all. So for me, this is about progressive realization. It's about looking to see what are, you know, the possibilities that auto-generated captions provide, but also to look to see what are the services that are in place that could be provided to assist lecturers to do this. And, you know, it certainly is my view that not all the obligations have to be met by the front of house person, the lecturer who's on the cold face, who's developing their PowerPoints the night before a lecture, using video capture and then publishing that content to the LMS. There needs to be, I suppose, tiers of support, and I mean tiers as in TIERS, not TEARS, tiers of support that need to be provided in order to make this realistic and realizable. What would be your view on that?
Do you mind if I give a comment, actually, Dónal, from an ahead perspective on that?
Yeah.
So I suppose just from the legal perspective, look, there is the disproportionate burden there. So if people are worried about the idea that they may have to, you know, within the LMS to provide captions for hundreds of lectures every day at a professional level, that's obviously, as Dónal said, it's clearly not realistic, and it would be clearly a disproportionate burden for institutions to do that. But as Dónal said, I think that being able to show that you're progressively working towards a higher level of automated captioning, and also ensuring that we're still applying the reasonable accommodation principle for those with very specific identified needs. I think that's really important too, that, you know, if we have, you know, deaf students in the room who require that, as it's going to be their sole way of accessing the content of the lecture, then it is important that is a professional standard. And also as well to use a common sense approach, maybe, whereby, for example, if you're providing public content on the front end of your website, well, that's a very different kettle of fish maybe than your everyday lecture that's going to be, you know, used maybe once off and repeated. So your front end website should have professional captions applied to your videos. That would be the way we would take the approach, I suppose, that we would take. And that for your live lectures, yes, work towards a high standard of automated captioning for live lectures and recorded lectures, and ensure that the reasonable accommodation principle is applied for those who need it, and you have a higher standard set there.
I've added some links into the typed response to that question, so it should be under the answered questions in the question and answer pane.
Just to say, I can see a comment from James saying there's something that HED could do to suggest to have a preferred supplier of captioning in Ireland. I don't think it's something that we could do just to take a stance on a commercial operation. You know, but look, there is a lot of good professional captioners. Like we have PCR here today, who do a great service, and there are others as well. But certainly, just to let people know that there was a question about guidance for higher education, that is something that's in AHEAD's work plan for this year, in particular around the design of the web accessibility statement and looking at the provision of resources for front-facing staff, so for student-facing staff. I'm looking at, if you like, that piece that Alistair said about the things that we can teach people in the 20-30 minutes, that will make a huge difference at the front end. So that's something we'll be focusing on later this year. And I think there was a question there earlier that I think you may have answered in the chat, which I think is really interesting. Again, it's just a clarification maybe that was already mentioned in the presentation, but someone said, what about the materials published by teachers on Moodle on the university site? Absolutely, they are included in the scope. So your PDFs, your Word documents, all of those things are included, and that's where we really need to do a big job, I think, as a sector in training those frontline staff to ensure that that's happening.
There's a point also in the chat. John Harding's made the point that you know, regulations not necessarily take into account the complexity of universities. And I know one Scottish university I was working with recently, in the first, I think it was the first 8 weeks of term, they created 2 years worth of human captioning. You know, if they had done all the captioning for all the lectures at human level, taking, you know, 2 hours or something for per lecture, it equated to about 2 years worth of human captioning in the first 8 weeks of term. So I think there are issues there. That's very different from your local council uploading, you know, uploading one video every 3 weeks or something. So I think context is, in the UK context, we've tried always to work very closely with our auditing body and to say, look, you know, what are you going to be looking at? How can we make sure that this doesn't backfire? Exactly the point Dónal was making there about, you know, you don't want unintended consequences. So there's negotiation. I think you can do it really well, being a smaller, less complicated nation. I think you'll be able to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I can only speak from my own experience to some degree, in that I work in a small research organization, and I've provided training to my colleagues and watched by the end of the hour as, you know, as researchers kind of get switched off when I start talking about accessibility checkers in Word and PDF. But what actually worked was a follow-up of 6 emails saying to them, well, here's how you do an accessible table, here's how you do an accessible PowerPoint.
Yeah.
And those little micro pieces of guidance are very often much better than the big bang approach. Now, I would say that there are people already in universities who have an interest and a capacity in this area. By all means, I would recommend to people on the call not to feel the need to defer to the NDA as the font of knowledge here. If you know how to do this stuff, then you can show a colleague, and then you can bring it up as a training topic within your team or your department, or maybe across the institution. And that really, I think, is what's going to make a practical effect in how, you know, the lecturers and people at the coalface, as we're calling them on this webinar, are actually providing accessible content. But let's not forget about the professional IT teams that are in the higher education institution. It's incumbent on them to make sure that whatever they procure is accessible, to conduct a review of their current systems, to gauge their level of compliance with the regulations, to ensure that the next time the LMS is upgraded, that accessibility is front and center in that upgrade. So there are role-based actions that need to happen right across the institution. But I think it's for me, it's about, you know, that level of progressive realization, and not forgetting the competence and the knowledge that is already existing within the organization, and leveraging that.
Thanks, Dónal. I think that's probably might be a a nice note to end on in some ways, that idea of progressive realization and the knowledge that does exist already, and what is there that we can look at tapping into. I feel like this is a discussion that we could stay chatting here for a long time, and I'm sure there are many more questions.
Do you mind, Orla, if I had one sentence to discussion before we go, just to say that two things. That one thing that's actually part of our plan is to do exactly what Dónal was describing with those micro bite-sized nuggets. So that's part of the plan of ahead. So that will be available, but it won't be available for some time until later in the year. And secondly, just one of the things ahead is doing is, I know the legal questions are often very hard to get a straight answer to. One of the things we have done is actually saw our own legal advice, which will be publishable, not as legal advice, but as just a way in for you to understand what one lawyer's opinion is on this stuff, and that's actually going to be available fairly soon. So hopefully in the coming sort of months that'll be available.
So on behalf of everyone at Ahead, I'd like to say thank you, Dónal, for sharing information about the legislation and the role and approach of the monitoring body, and then Alistair to say a big thank you for sharing some of your experience. I think it's been really useful, and certainly something that people are turning their attention to more and more, and I think this will be a conversation that continues.